Welcome to RetinUp, where new conversations in retina happen. I am Scott Krzywonos.
And I'm John Kitchens.
John, this is our first episode. Let's tell the audience what RetinUp is, how this whole thing started, and what we're hoping to do.
Well, Scott, I think RetinUp is basically informal retinal conversations, the type of conversations that you love to have with your colleagues on text or at meetings. We just got done with AAO. We're going to talk about AAO here later. The stuff that's not sponsored by industry, that's just our own thoughts. I've always valued your opinion, Scott, working with you on a variety of projects, editor-in-chief of Retina Today. I mean, you know industry, and I feel like I know retina. And so I think it just is a valuable conversation. So we're going to treat this just like we're hanging out at a bar after a full day of AAO sub day and talking about what went on.
Yeah, that's exactly how we started talking, right? Was over a drink or over a meal or in the hallways of some meeting. And what happens on the podium is interesting, but the conversations that happen in the hallway outside of the podium room are, in my opinion, always more compelling. And we haven't found a lot of places where those are captured just yet. So we're hoping to recreate them here. We're also going to interview some leaders and luminaries in the field and also some people that are not necessarily in the field, but can inform what's happening in the field, right? We're talking about investment bankers, policy experts, regulatory people that, can really provide some insight into what's happening here and places that you really wouldn't find them anywhere else.
Yeah, and Scott, we're really honored tonight. On this episode, we're going to have Cedric Francois, CEO of Apellis. And what I love about Cedric is the fact that he's the inventor of Syfovre, the CEO of the company. He's taken it from basic science all the way through to commercialization, and it's just an amazing story.
Well, before we get to Cedric, let's get to our discussion about AAO. We have a few topics we want to hit. The first one, John, you were really interested in this. It kept coming up in our conversations, whole eye transplant. This was shared by Vedaheta Danya at Retina Subspecialty Day. She was part of a team that successfully transplanted the first full eye transplant. I wasn't in the room, though. What was this all about?
Scott, we've heard about this from press releases and PR, and when you read about it online, you're kind of like, okay, is this a scam? Like, did this really happen, or is this just sensationalism or something made up by AI? But no, she actually presented. Now, I think it's important to understand the rationale behind it. This is a worker who had a terrible work-related injury, had lost his eye, and a really disfiguring injury, unfortunately. And so they were going to go in and help him cosmetically. There was no intent to make this a seeing eye, but they actually figured out that they could take a part of the facial artery and reanastomose it with the ophthalmic artery and have an eye that actually, after healing, and a lot of swelling, it didn't look great the first month or two, but after healing, looked great. The circulation reestablished, and you could actually see on an angiogram blood flow to the retina. The retina didn't work. I mean, you severed the optic nerve, but they showed some interesting functional MRI where it showed potential that the optic nerve was trying to regenerate. I mean, it was fascinating, and it was a sustainable, living eye in this patient, non-functional, and was frankly amazing. And it just makes you think maybe we're not that far away from something like that if we can ever find a way to get the nerves to reconnect. You just think sticking an eye in somebody's head and reanastomosing vessels, it's just going to die and turn Tysical. But that didn't happen. It actually maintained pressure and maintained a normal looking anterior chamber and perfusion. It was fascinating.
So this was first done in 2023. So we're approaching, a year and a half, 2 years that this patient has had this eye?
Yeah. And still has it. Now, patient has to be on immunosuppressive medicines to avoid rejection, but it was really amazing. Now, unfortunately, because of some of the injuries, he had dramatic ptosis, and so there was no way to correct that. So the eyes closed most of the time, but when they showed images of it open, it was really, really amazing.
Where do you think this leads? What is the next step here? Because this was, I guess, a somewhat cosmetic surgery, but really it seems like a proof of concept that this is even possible. I'm curious what step 2, step 3, step 4 is.
Well, it was really well thought out. I mean, this was not a fly-by-night, hey, let's just see if we can take an eye and stick it in somebody else's head and see if it maintains. They actually thought this through. Is IRB obtained to do this? Patient obviously was fully informed and consented. But I think it's a great example of the fact that the vascular supply really may not be an issue for us. We might actually be able to get an eye in there and establish blood flow. And now it's about, okay, how do you do that without damaging the retina when you're doing the transplant? And then how do you reconnect the nerves? And I tell my patients all the time, we're looking at spinal cord injury research and other things. When you see a breakthrough on that, that's when you're going to start to see potential that we can actually reconnect the nerves and start to get some potential function there. But it's
Yeah, I
a
think
pie in the sky. Thanks, God. I mean, gosh, we see patients all the time who've lost vision in one eye and they ask, can I get a transplant? And you say, no, I'm afraid not. I mean, and you think to yourself, that'll never happen. But actually with this, you think, gosh, one of the major obstacles actually they've demonstrated it can be overcome.
now, obviously, you never want to explain to a patient what an eye transplant is at risk of making them think that this is a possibility that's right around the corner. But if you were trying to explain this surgery to somebody who doesn't have surgical experience, maybe somebody who's in our field, right, in industry, but isn't necessarily in the surgical side of things, or is a trainee, how would you explain it? I don't want you to explain it like I'm five, but explain it like I kind of know, a little
Yeah.
bit about retina.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the gentleman who had the injury was missing an eye, and they took a cadaver eye, a donor eye, freshly harvested, and they basically transected the optic nerve, took off the extraocular muscles, and actually put it in the place where that eye formerly was. And the real key is that they were able to anastomose that facial artery
What does that mean?
to the ophthalmic artery. So the facial artery in the patient was still there. And so they could take actually a more external artery and connect it up with the ophthalmic artery, which is the artery that actually supplies the blood flow to the eye. And
Okay.
then once again, I would have never thought that could have worked and you could see blood flow into the eye, but actually you can. And it looks like a normal angiogram when they did the angiogram several months later.
Every now and then these things sneak up on you at academy. It can be a sleepy session, and then suddenly you see whole eye transplant and you wake up. There were a few other things at AAO that have been eating at you. I know you brought them up a few times. Two of them concern Alcon products, Unity, and then LumiThera, their new acquisition. And then the third thing was AREDS 3 vitamins. We're familiar with AREDS 2 vitamins, but I guess there's a Return of the Jedi version of this. There's a third version. So let's start with the Alcon stuff. What's on your mind regarding Unity and LumiThera?
Well, I have to say, first and foremost, a lot of this, it comes from walking around the showroom floor, being involved with companies, consulting, and nothing that's proprietary or anything such as that. And I will have to admit, Scott, I'm an Alcon guy. So when I talk about Unity and LumiThera, both of which are Alcon products, I do consult for Alcon, and I love Alcon as a manufacturer and the people that I work with there. But most particularly Unity, which is their new vitreoretinal system. First system in 14 years since we had the Constellation, just rolled out. And this was really kind of the first major trade show that they were able to show it at. And it has a lot of real advantages. We've had a chance to use it. I've used it on about 50 cases or so. The real change is the difference in the fluidics. So instead of actually having a Venturi or vacuum-based pump, you're going to have a flow-based system. You basically control flow. It's almost like having a self-driving car or a car with auto cruise versus using an accelerator. It's going to adapt for you, and it's got a lot of advantages, and I won't go into them here. But what I was really surprised by is that it's a pretty pricey piece of capital equipment, and we're in a age right now where surgery centers are getting reimbursed less. Surgeries are going to surgery centers, not hospitals where they tend to get paid more and have bigger capital budgets. But the number of people actually adopting this early on, I mean, they are really putting this into not just academic centers, but into surgery centers and other places like that. And so the adoption for this has been remarkable.
Is that because there's a certain life cycle to a vitrectomy platform? Are constellations from 13 years ago just getting to the point that they need a refresh and this is the opportunity?
Constellation is still a great machine. It's crazy.
Okay.
You look at it and you go, gosh. So one of the big things I had before we started testing the Unity is, do I really need this? Because I can still do everything pretty well with the Constellation, and they're bulletproof. I mean, when they're working and stable, you don't really have a lot of breakdowns with the system. So that kind of surprises me, that mainly not that people are adopting it. I think within the next 5 years, we're going to see a pretty significant adoption, but that they're adopting it so fast and in this current economic climate. So it tells me that there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of enthusiasm around it. And I mean, listen, if you get into vitreoretinal surgery, you're most likely going to be in love with the gear. You're going to be a gearhead and a
Right.
tech person, and the tech on this thing is absolutely amazing. One of the things I had a chance to do actually at AAO was do a session for Alcon with Maria Baracol and Steve Charles, and talk to them about the features and the benefits of it. It's just a great chance to sit with them. Steve, major innovator and one of the big driving forces behind the development of this system.
Yeah, of course. It's interesting because this comes out right, what, maybe a year and a half or a year later from Zeiss acquiring Dork or merging with Dork and adopting the EVA Nexus and really making a push there. So this, from a competitive landscape, this looks like it's not a response. This has been something that's been years in the making, but nevertheless, these two initiatives are occurring right around the same time.
Yeah. And credit to Dork. I mean, Dork was the first one to bring out the flow-based vitrectomy. I mean, they really established that narrative in the U.S. with their EVA system. And I haven't used the EVA system in several years, but it'd be interesting now to go back and compare and contrast it to the Unity system after I've had a chance to use it. And then the other big product that Alcon has acquired was LumiThera, which is a light-based. It's actually the Veleda system, but it's by LumiThera.
This is the photobiomodulation system.
Photobiomodulation, yeah. And so this is a lot of interest. There's a lot of questions around it. Some would say controversy around this, particularly because it's targeted towards patients with dry macular degeneration. But the LightSight 2 and LightSight 3 studies did show some improvement in visual acuity, although the placebo group also improved a bit, not as much as the treated group. But the biggest thing is, and the biggest rub, Scott, is it's self-pay. And it's a cash pay thing that you can establish however much you want to have the patients pay for this. And so it's interesting to see that enter into the retina world and to see some of the skepticism and some of the adoption behind this. And once again, from an Alcon perspective, the big thing Alcon does is lend credibility to this technology. And you could kind of feel that at Academy, that Alcon being behind this makes people go, oh, wait a second, maybe this is something we should take a look at, because Alcon very rarely invests in things that don't work.
Yeah, I'm curious if Alcon's going to be able to marshal its resources behind the Veleda light delivery system and give us some post-marketing data that are really clean and clear. I think one of the challenges with LightSight 2 and LightSight 3 is that some of the data were opaque. I wasn't sure necessarily what to make with them. The people at Alcon do not screw around. They know exactly what they're doing. They are engineering everything exquisitely and very elegantly. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the next couple of years we get some data that help reinforce why somebody might turn to photobiomodulation.
I'll tell you, the biggest thing for me is and we have it in our practice, actually, and we were first place in Kentucky to actually have this, and one of the first in the nation, is hearing feedback from patients. And hearing patients say, it makes me see better, I can function better. And so I'm really interested in getting patients in and hearing about their experience, because when you're paying several thousands of dollars, and most of what I'm hearing for, I think, 9 sessions in a month, and you do it 2 or 3 times a year, most are averaging between $2,000 and maybe $3,000 per eye, which is pricey for patients. But if you're going to have patients that stick with it, and they have to stick with it to get the gains, they're going to have to see, they're going to have to actually have some functional benefit there. And so I'm interested to hear as these patients come back. Now, also realize that the peak improvement in visual acuity is usually about 2 to 3 months after the last session. And the way this works is by ramping up, I think, the mitochondria actually in the retina to actually help the retina function better. So it's kind of like CrossFit for your retina. And I've had one patient that's done it so far, and she actually says, I definitely know I can see better, which I thought was interesting. And so I need to see more to make sure it's not a placebo effect to really fully endorse it for my patients, but it certainly is an outside the box way of thinking. And if it adds something or some improvement to these patients who have no avenue for improvement with current therapies, it would be a great thing.
Quickly, AREDS 3 vitamins, what do we need to know? Because I totally missed this at AAO.
So this is one, I was on the showroom floor. Friend Bo texted me and said, hey, can you meet with us? He works for BNL. And so we want to run something by you. It's AREDS 3. And I thought, what? I don't even know anything about AREDS 3. We were in the AREDS and AREDS 2 study. Our practice was amazing National Eye Institute study with 4,000 or 5,000 patients in 5 to 10 years. I mean,
legacy studies.
Legacy studies. I mean, we learned so much about it. So I said, gosh, I didn't even know they were planning an AREDS study. Well, it turns out actually that they're going to launch the AREDS 3 vitamins next year, actually, and then the study's going to follow. And basically, the AREDS 3 will have a lower level of zinc. It'll still have lutein and zeaxanthine, so it'll be very similar to the AREDS 2 formulation. Turns out you don't need as much zinc. And then some B vitamins that actually have been shown in some studies to potentially reduce progression of dry macular degeneration. So it's going to be interesting to see AREDS 3 vitamins showing up on shelves and patients coming in and going, hey, here's my new AREDS 3. And you're going to look and say, hey, it's Bausch & Lomb, which Preservision is Bausch & Lomb. I mean, that's
Right.
the gold standard of AREDS and AREDS 2 vitamins. So the nice thing is they are going to follow it with a study. So this is not just going to be, we're just going to put this out there and have anecdotal evidence. They actually are going to do a study, and the way they're going to do it's yet to be determined. But it'll be interesting to see how that goes launching before we actually have any data on it.
Well, I'm sure we're going to talk about those data once we actually get them. But for now, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to speak with Cedric Francois, the co-founder and CEO and president at Apellis Pharmaceuticals. Hey there, listeners. If you are subscribed to the show, thank you. If you're not subscribed, do so on your podcast platform. Alternatively, you can sign up for our newsletter where we will let you know when we have a new episode dropping. I promise we will not spam you. We are only telling you when we have a new episode. You can do that by visiting our website, RetinUp.com, RetinUp.com.
So, Scott, how does a surgeon in Belgium end up starting a company in Louisville that develops the first ever therapy for a leading cause of vision loss?
Well, I suspect that we're about to find out. Who are we talking to?
Well, Scott, for our first ever guest on the RetinUp podcast, we welcome Cedric Francois. Cedric is the CEO of Apellis, who developed the first ever therapy for geographic atrophy. But before that, Cedric was a student at the University of Louisville. And before that, he was a surgeon in Belgium. So I am so excited to get to know Cedric and hear his story, which sounds absolutely fascinating, and learn a little bit more about what it takes to be a CEO of a major company, his past influences as a surgeon, and just how rigorous he is with the way that Apellis does science. It's really, truly remarkable. So, Cedric, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you, and we really look forward to having you as our first guest on RetinUp.
Thank you so much, John, and what a privilege and honor to be here, and especially with you, with my Kentucky heart and my Kentucky roots. It means a lot. Thank you.
So, Cedric, how do you go from a surgery resident in Belgium to research and transplantation to a CEO of a major company with a groundbreaking treatment for macular degeneration? What's that look like?
Yeah, so John, it's a story with a lot of serendipity in it, as everything in life. And to be clear, in Belgium, I went to medical school, but I actually did not finish my residency. And the way in which I ended up in our home in Kentucky was quite, through various routes as well. I was going to do plastic surgery in Belgium, but at the time decided that I wanted to go to Argentina instead. I was in love. I loved that country as well. I had done my internship there. And I kind of went without knowing what was going to happen. Started pediatric surgery in Argentina. And while I was there, did a research project on my own with a child that had a myoelectric prosthesis, which is like an arm that you can move with your upper arm muscles, and try to introduce a form of sensation into that prosthesis. Fell in love with research that way. And my mentor at the time in Cordoba, his best friend, had gone to medical school with him and was in Louisville preparing the first hand transplantation ever done in history in Louisville, Kentucky. His name was John Barker. I spoke to him, we really liked each other, and he offered me to come and join his team at the time. But there was a 1-year hiatus between that moment and going to Louisville. I was completely broke, had to make some money, and I also worked for a year as a ship physician for Carnival Cruise Lines. Many stories there, probably for another day, but it was an amazing journey where I ended up being in Louisville, being a fellow in plastic surgery research, while also doing my PhD in physiology with immunology in it, of course. And at the time, during all of that work, my best friend was going to Harvard Business School, and he was starting a company called Potentia Pharmaceuticals. We spoke one day, I fell in love with what they were doing, and all of a sudden became part of that effort and met Pascal de Châtelet and Paul Olsen, who became my co-founders in a company called Potentia Pharmaceuticals. And Potentia was the company that really started looking into complements and, was the genesis, not just behind Potentia, but also behind the formation of Apellis.
But early 2000s, we weren't talking a lot about complement. I mean, it was in the earlier 2000s that we had the first complement factor H papers that came out, anti-VEGF therapy. What was it that drew you into complement?
Yeah, good luck. It's strange how these things go, really. At the time when Pascal and Paul and I were kind of working, they called us the Three Stooges in Louisville. That was our company. We were very interested in a cell type called macrophages, which are a type of white blood cells involved in all types of things in immunology. But at the time, in the early days, in the early 2000s, were believed to be, like all other cells, what we call terminally differentiated. So they go into a certain tissue, they behave a certain way, and then they die. And then it was discovered that these cells can behave very differently and adapt to circumstances, even though they are sitting in a particular tissue. And that drew our attention, and we were very interested in seeing if we could change the behavior of these macrophages in the context of battling certain chronic diseases. Now, we were very naive at the time, and we came up with a super sophisticated, cool project where we created a molecule that could do effectively that. For the specialists on the call, these were antibodies that we reduced. We attached the head group of phosphatidylserine to it. Long story short is we could make living cells look as though they were dead to macrophages. Super cool. Like, okay, here is a window into something great. Let's raise money for this. Spoke to investors, and then we got the question, what is the cost of goods of this product? And we're like, what is that? Because we had never done this. And we do the back of the envelope calculation. It turned out it was going to cost $2 million per year to make it, to treat these patients, which seemed a little too steep. And then when we were like figuring out what are we going to do with this, one day we saw a poster on complement, and Pascal and I looked at each other. We're like, that would be a great way to change macrophage phenotypes, which is, by the way, the title of our first patent application. And then we went to the computer, went on Google, which was a new thing at the time. That's how old I am in the meantime. And we Googled complement inhibitors. That is literally how it all started. And started our company looking into complement inhibition that way.
That's amazing. So how then did you take it from that, we're Googling complement inhibitors, to actually starting one of the first ever complement inhibitor companies in Potentia?
Yeah, so that is actually a really fun story, because 2005, I think, is probably the most historical year in the retina since 2000, right? I mean, because within one and the same year, the first anti-VEGF therapy came out in the form of Macugen. And iTech at the time was kind of a crown jewel of biotech. I mean, they were figuring all these beautiful things out. And we're like, okay, let's see if we can apply complement inhibition to macular degeneration. And we became convinced at the time, and we still are today, that macrophage misbehavior was at the root cause behind this particular disease. But we had to raise money, of course. And so at the time, especially coming from Kentucky, raising what we call venture capital was not an easy concept. So we went looking for angel investors, which are, for those familiar with entrepreneurial activities, are individuals, typically wealthy individuals that will invest in your company. And we found one individual in particular. His name was Bernard Darty, who became a dear friend afterwards. Said, look, I really like what you're doing. My wife has macular degeneration that runs in my family. I would like to meet you. And as it so happens, next week we have the Macula Society, and found out it was in Key Biscayne in the Ritz-Carlton. I mean, very fancy stuff. Thankfully, at the time, Macula Society was not yet, or industry was not yet very present in the retina, not at all like it is today. I had to pay $5,000 at the time, a fortune for us. I was also very young, but I'm like, okay, let's go and try this. And I remember at the time going to the hotel, and he said, like, look, I would like you to meet a specialist and talk to this specialist about what you're doing, because I cannot really understand that. I'm like, okay, that's fine, and started sweating a little bit, because I said, can I bring my own specialist to talk to your specialist? And he said, yeah, but the first 30 minutes is going to be just you. And then I got to the Macula Society, to the Ritz, and there was a room set up for him and I to meet. And like in medical school, when I had an oral exam, I would of course learn all of my subjects, but I would always learn specifically what that professor had been doing their whole career, because usually that's what they end up asking questions about. So I learned everything I could possibly read about the specialists that this individual was going to bring. And how did I narrow it down from, I think at the time, 250 to a much smaller number was, I said, he's French, I'm Belgian, so I can say this as a European. French people like to invite French people. There were 3 members of the Macula Society at the time that were French, and I studied every paper that these 3 individuals had ever published by heart. I also learned everything I could about the individual I was meeting and his family and his story. And when I ended up going into the room, I will never forget this, I saw Mr. Darty. We got introduced. I said, it's very nice to meet you. And he said, this is my wife, Paulette. And I said, oh, like the opera singer. Turns out in the 19th century, there was an opera singer called Paulette Darty, who no one's ever heard about anymore. But I had Googled all of that. And he looks at me, how do you know that? And I turned red like a tomato. I really like opera. And then anyway, past that one, he looked at me stone cold, like, okay, I'm on to you. Like, we sat down, and then in walks Gabriel Coscas. And I'm like, okay, really good so far. I had read every paper, and as you know, John, Gabriel was very famous because of his work on indocyanine and green imaging. And so as we had our discussion about what we were doing with macrophages, at some point he asks a question, and I have the ability to throw ICG in there. And it was like, it was hook, line, and sinker, because he immediately asks me, okay, so what about ICG, this and that, or whatever? And I said, well, like in your paper in Retina in 1996 on page 1200, and jaw-dropping moments, and I sealed the deal right there. So that was our first big $1 million investment, really the genesis behind Potentia. So now I had the Macula Society to tackle, and I still remember going to the big oval lawn in front of the Ritz there. I knew nobody, and I started walking out, and as soon as people saw that I was industry and that I was a child, basically, nobody wanted to talk to me. 2 people were very, very kind to me, and that was Jason Slachter and Phil Rosenfeld at the time, who kind of really listened to me and had an amazing conversation with them. Also, Tony Adamus, who at the time was the chief scientific officer for iTech, was super nice. I saw him last week at AAO, and he still remembers that conversation that we had at the time. And this was an amazing moment, during the gala, I serendipitously end up sitting between Michael Klein and his wife. And so Michael Klein from Oregon, who in the meantime, of course, has retired. And I start talking first to Mary, his wife, and she says like, hey, Michael, you should talk to this young man. He's really interesting. And so Michael and I start talking, and I tell him what I'm doing. And Michael turns like, really? Like, how do you know that? And I'm like, what do you mean? And he says, look, I cannot tell you now, but in a couple of months, you will know what I'm talking about. And when you know, you can call me and I will join your scientific advisory board. And he was at the time reviewing one of the 3 science papers that were going to come out simultaneously on that association between complement factor H and macular degeneration.
Well, the Sentinel papers.
Sentinel papers. And so it was kind of a weird coincidence. And a few months later, obviously, these papers came out. I called Michael. He did join our scientific advisory board. And then I went to Jason Slachter, and I sat down with him in his office in New York. And I said, look, I know that we've only just met and we haven't even really dated yet. I said, but would you like to be our chief medical officer? And Jason Slachter said, okay. And that was the genesis behind the company Potentia.
Was that Macula Society, Cedric, when you kind of realized like, I can do this? Or did you always kind of have this feeling of, I'm destined to do this. I know I'm going to do this.
That's a good question. I think the one thing that my parents taught me was to not be afraid to fail. And so I try so much stupid stuff all the time, and most of the time it goes wrong, and then once in the time it works, And also I happen to have been very lucky with the people that I worked with, right? I mean, so especially Pascal de Châtelet, who still is the chief scientific officer at Apellis, like he and I are yin and yang, like we work so well together, and he's a very grounded, one of the smartest people you'll ever meet. And, he'll tell me that's really dumb, but I like that.
Cedric, when you formed Potentia, and many people know Apellis for APL2, which became pegcetacoplan and Syfovre. In the clinical studies, it was known as APL2. But not many people know that APL1 was a potentia drug that was the first complement inhibitor. What was it about APL1 that just didn't quite get it done? And what did you learn from that helped you in the development of Syfovre?
Yeah. That is a really, really good and important question, John. So for those retina specialists that were involved with us at the time, and you may remember this, John, we call it PLT4 at the time, which is the same molecule as APL1. A lot of people joked about POT4 macular degeneration, but that's a different story. That was unintentional, but that came back to us. But that was a molecule that was miraculous in how good it is at controlling the complement pathways. And we obviously found out later on how good it really is, but had one problem, and that is that it is quite prone to aggregation. So as we were testing this molecule, we saw all the effects that we were pursuing. But when this drug was being injected intravitreally in patients, also in preclinical testing, it would form a dense gel deposit. And at the time, we thought maybe this is like a sustained release, like analog equivalent. But that turned out not to be the case because it's not zero, not even first order kinetics. Like it takes a long, long time to dissolve, way too long. And what happened, and we're now talking in the 2005 to 2009 window, as we were testing that, Alcon became very interested. A couple of other companies became very interested in partnering with us, potentially buying us. And they also believed in kind of the ability of that molecule to accomplish that goal. It was never really fully tested in a clinical setting because in 2009, in the middle of the financial crisis, Potentia was then acquired by Alcon. There was a licensing with an option to acquire. And after that, for a couple of years, we had no ability to work in the eye. So when we started Apellis, our initial goal was set out to not do retina anymore, but to try to control complement C3 in the whole body systemically, which was a bold goal at the time because, there's so much C3 in the body. I mean, like it's one of the most broadly produced proteins in the liver. It was also a question, can that be done safely on such a rather massive basis? But we saw kind of how the molecule worked, what it did, etc. And thankfully, we were right about that. I mean, we can talk at some other point about our systemic products, but it's absolutely insane what that complement control can do and do safely on a systemic basis as well. But then in 2014, for those of you that remember that, right? I mean, between 2010 and 2014, Alcon was acquired by Novartis. Novartis then was working on the molecule, was not meeting the diligence requirements. And in 2014, we were able, with the shell that Potentia that had remained, to buy that molecule back. And then Apellis bought Potentia at the time. And that's how all of the intellectual property of the work came back to us. And that Apellis, we decided at the time, look, instead of trying to continue with POT4/APL1, let's continue with our systemic drug and inject that drug intravitreally. And at the time, I had a conversation with Len Schleifer, because a lot of people have forgotten that Eylea is also a systemic drug called Zeltrap for cancer, right? And I asked Len, I said, so listen, we have this great molecule. We want to use it in the eye. People are talking to us about, beware the Lucentis Avastin story and all of that stuff. And he told me, he said, look, if it's the right molecule and the right science, that's what you should do. And so we did. And we took pegcetacoplan literally from getting the rights back to dosing the first patient in phase 2. So all the way through toxicology, the initial safety, everything was done in 18 months. When we started the Philly trial in 2016.
Now, Cedric, this is all happening, it starts in Louisville, it ends up in Boston. Louisville's not the biohub tech that Boston is. How did you decide where you were going to start building your team as you're transitioning from one to the next? How did you decide to settle on Boston? What's the difference in the vibes between the two? Just tell us a little bit about that decision-making process, because it's a pretty big one.
It is. And I have a very soft spot for Louisville, but at some point, reality also needs to be taken in consideration. Drug development is such a specialized area. I mean, frankly, for people that are not involved in it, including myself at the time, I mean, you cannot fathom how much goes into the quality, the controls, the manufacturing. I mean, it is absolutely endless. The regulatory interactions, all of this requires deep specialized knowledge. And there simply is not a bench available, unfortunately, in Kentucky to rapidly hire the types of people that we needed. That process has been slower than maybe, yes, but in 2017, when we went public, And when we had to scale very rapidly, I really had no choice but to make the move. But having said that, Louisville was an amazing incubation place for us. Frankly, I mean, we had so much support from the community. It's one of the best places. I still have my home there. I go back whenever I can.
And you still have an office here. Cedric, you mentioned Lynn Schleifer, and I consider you and Lynn similar in so many ways, and really two of the great founder CEOs that we have in retina, really the only two founder CEOs of approved products, and you're both physicians. And so I wonder if that gives you a different perspective and gives you a greater passion and impact with the drugs. I mean, we certainly feel the passion that you have for Apellis and for this product. Lynn, in a very similar way, as I've spoken to him before, incredibly passionate about aflibercept. Does it set you apart? Does it make things different than just being a CEO that's brought in to run a company?
Well, I think when you found a company, you are deeply in love with your project, right? Which can be a liability as well, right? I mean, sometimes you have to make hard choices that sometimes you don't make because of that. I do think that, I am first and foremost a physician. That is, I became a doctor because I love medicine and I love caring for patients. And even though I don't do it on a day-to-day basis anymore, that is really where I find joy in my life.
Cedric, John mentioned that you moved from, founder, co-founder to CEO, and that's not a typical archetype. That's two very different skill sets, right? Being on the foundational side of a company and then being in charge of a publicly traded company those are two very different hats. What learnings are there in your experience that a future founder to CEO might find useful? Was there anything that you had to learn the hard way that you wish, you could tell to somebody in the future, just something that would make their life a little bit easier during that transition?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I happen to teach sometimes at the business school in Yale, and that's the question that I get quite often because it's an entrepreneurial class. And for me, I don't know what the right answer is, but to me specifically, I love to lead with authenticity, whether that is with our employees, whether that is with investors, whether that is with physicians, because I think that especially when you're in biotech and you have, there's such deep meaning in what we do, right? I mean, I love The Office, the series, right? I mean, Michael Scott gives meaning to selling paper, right? Because that is amazing, man. I mean, we have to give meaning to make the lives of people better. I mean, it's really not a high bar, right? So kind of embracing that, I think, especially in biotech, is easy. But I think when you have a background like mine, which is maybe not as self-evident for what we're trying to do, I didn't go to HBS or any of these things. I had no business background at all. I think the learning that I had was that, as long as you know what you don't know, surround yourself with the right people, and are always honest with those people and with yourself to the extent that you can, then you can make a really big difference. And I have one story that I always kind of tell in that context, and it's one of my favorite founder stories ever. Going back to 2003, at the Three Stooges in Louisville, we had to we had to raise our first money, not $1 million, right? I'm $300,000 to survive. And I go to New York and I have to do my pitch, and I had like a whole presentation. I mean, all the stuff and my business friends taught me how to do it. And I went from investor to investor and nothing was working. And one day I went into an office on 1221 Avenue of the Americas in New York, which was where the original employees of Morgan Stanley were housed. And there was somebody there called Fred Whittemore. They called him Uncle Fred. And I met with him for an hour. And at the end of the hour, he was like, yeah, not for me. But the thing was, with this guy, man, I felt the connection. And I walked out and I felt dirty. I felt like I had not be myself. And the whole night I couldn't sleep. In the morning I got up, I bought a bottle of wine, gave it to his assistant. I said, can I please see Mr. Whittemore again? Without appointment. And she was nice. She felt pity for me, I think. Told me to wait in the corridor. He walks by. I said, Mr. Whittemore, can I have 3 more minutes of your time? He's a little annoyed, but we sit down and I look at him and I said, look, everything you told me yesterday is true. Like, we don't have anything, but the 2 people I work with are the best people I ever met. And we're going to do all we can to make this happen. And he takes his intercom and he's like, Sheila, write me a check for $100,000, please. And I'm like, so this is how it's done.
Amazing.
This is how it's done, at least in my experience, because this guy was giving us the opportunity to live out our dream with his money. I mean, that was created kind of this ethos of a deep sense of responsibility towards what this man, but in the future, other types of investors, all the way up to today with pension funds and everybody else, right, take such enormous risks. And we have the privilege of doing that with the money that's not ours, right? And I think, again, just being truthful and honest and transparent through all that you do is something that we are very proud of, and that served us well, and that led to what we've been able to build.
Well, Cedric, it's been an unbelievable pleasure. You took a true risk coming on our very first podcast. And I can't tell you how much Scott and I appreciate that. And what a wonderful chance it's been to get to know your background, the history of Apellis, and how you've made this great company. Thank you again, Cedric, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, John. It was absolutely my pleasure, and I'll be back anytime. And to do the first one really means a lot. Thank you.
We are definitely going to take you up on that, have you back on the podcast, if for nothing else than to talk about the cruise stories, which we'll all want to hear.
I'll be delighted to. Thank you so much, John.
Hey there, listeners. Keep an ear out for one of our upcoming episodes where we will be at the Cencora Vision Exchange meeting in Dallas-Fort Worth. This is a pretty exclusive meeting. Not a lot of people know about it. It might be new on your radar. If you're there and you see us, stop by and say hi. If you're not able to make it, tune into the show. That was a wild interview. That was really, really fun. Not where we expected it to go, but there was a lot to learn there. John, your quick takeaways. Give us a little debrief.
Well, I think the thing that listeners and viewers will appreciate about Cedric is just what a lovable, genuine person that he is, and just how passionate he is about what he does. That comes off not only in things like this podcast, but especially when you meet him in person. You know, I love this founder, CEO, physician kind of trifecta. When you have that, you have somebody that understands the situations we're in and caring for patients and what that means, that responsibility. They have the passion of being the founder, and then they develop this skill of being a CEO. It's just really magical. And I think it's what makes him so endearing to people in retina who have any chance to work with Cedric.
Yeah, he had a real sense of responsibility here, right? He talks about not only the responsibility to some initial investors or shareholders, but eventually, investors and pension plans, right? He feels like he's part of a whole ecosystem and that he has not just scientific obligations, but really professional and social obligations to uphold. I think it speaks to his character.
Oh, and absolutely. And the greatest responsibility is understanding this disease process for patients. And his commitment to that is just, it shines through. And so it was really great. I couldn't have imagined him being a better interview at all, and a great first interview, but that's just who he is. And that's why we chose him for our first episode.
I'll tell you what, if I'm a future founder / CEO, I'm listening to his story about being super prepared for conversations with potential allies or investors, or I'm taking away the lesson that being present is one of the most important things, right? He goes to Macula Society. He goes, $5,000 is a lot of money. The ROI on that was obvious in hindsight, but at the time he was probably still really petrified. But sure enough, here he is bumping into, retina legends just on the oval in front of the Ritz-Carlton.
Yeah, it was really about his preparation and timing. I mean, because it couldn't have come at a better time. That was right when the fundamental foundation of complement and its involvement in macular degeneration was being established. And so it's being prepared and being at the right place at the right time. So preparation meets luck, and you get opportunity, and Cedric has taken full advantage of that opportunity to our benefit and to our patients' benefits.
All right, well, that's a wrap for our first episode of RetinUp. Thank you for joining us. If you like what you heard, please subscribe on whatever podcast platform you use. That's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, something else that I didn't mention just there. Visit RetinUp.com to sign up for our newsletter. We'll let you know when we have a new episode. If you're watching on YouTube, which I know some of you are, leave a comment. We might read it on the show. And if you want to hear John's thoughts on anything, whether it's related to practice, your career, something even remotely tangential to ophthalmology, email a voice recording to info@retinup.com. That's it for this first episode. Thanks for joining us.